Welcome to this Ask the Insider Live. Give me a second to invite our very special guest and we'll get started. We'll join in just a second. We have a really exciting episode on tap for today. Some really breakthrough technology in addressing cat allergies. And it looks like our guest is coming up now. And we'll get started in just a minute. We've got some other people joining as well. Hi, Dr. Satyaraj.
Hello. Pleasure.
How are you?
Doing well.
Good. We'll get started in just a minute. We're just going to let a few people join, make sure everything is going correctly. Excellent. And we'll officially get started.
Right.
I'm already excited that all of our technology has worked on the first attempt today. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, it looks like we've got some people joining. I'm already starting to see some familiar faces here. So let's get started. I want to officially welcome everyone to today's episode of Ask the Insider. We appreciate you tuning in. Today's episode is Inside Pet Allergens and Purina Pro Plan LiveClear. I'm your host, otherwise known as the Insider today. My name is Gary Falcetano. I'm a licensed PA for over 25 years with extensive experience in emergency medicine and primary care. More recently, in the last 11 years, I've been focused on allergy and immunology. I'm currently the scientific affairs manager for allergy at Thermo Fisher Scientific. In this role, I provide education to both specialist and primary care clinicians in the area of allergy, as well as I work with leading scientists and researchers in the field of allergic disease. One of those scientists and researchers is actually my guest today, and we'll meet him in just a minute. I do want to encourage you to ask questions. You can put them in the comments. Our team will be monitoring the comments and relaying them to us during the Q&A portion of the live. So without further ado, as I mentioned, I'm joined by a very special guest today, Dr. Ebenezer Satyaraj, who is a brilliant scientist. He is also the director of molecular nutrition at Nestle Purina Research and the lead researcher of Purina Pro Plan LiveClear. Dr. Satyaraj, would you mind kind of telling us a little bit about yourself? And I understand there's a personal connection to today's topic as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for this opportunity. That's a great way to be able to talk about some of the amazing science we do. My background is in immunology. I'm an immunologist by training. I did my PhD back in India, came to the US to do a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Chicago. Then I was in the faculty at Northwestern before moving to industry. I came to Nestle almost 20 years ago with the express goal of setting up a nutritional immunology program. And one of the projects that I initiated when I started that is led to Pro Plan LiveClear that we're going to talk about today. I've had various roles in the company, and as you mentioned earlier, currently I'm director of molecular nutrition. And what my team does is understands how nutrition impacts health at the molecular level. So let me tell you the story that, or the event that led to the work that eventually led to the development of Pro Plan LiveClear.
Absolutely.
As you know, many things in science happens when you connect the dots. Some of the greatest inventions that have influenced or impacted lives in the last couple of centuries have started this way. Penicillin, for example, X-rays, radioactivity, even Teflon that used to coat our non-stick cookware came from a serendipitous connection between two different things. So the event that I'm telling you started almost about a decade and a half ago when our daughter, who was very young, returned one summer afternoon after spending her time with a friend having a play date. And as soon as she walked into the house, we noticed that she had red eyes, it was watery, and there were some slight rashes on her skin. After some frantic phone calls, we quickly realized that she had spent the better part of the afternoon playing with a newly adopted cat that their friend's family had, and that she's allergic to cats. So that was kind of the personal connection. Right around that time, there were some discussions happening within my team about the genes that regulate the important protein, FeLD1, which is the primary allergen that most people respond to. And that led to the idea of asking the question, is there a way for us to be able to mask the protein so that it doesn't interact with the human machinery that leads to develop symptoms of allergy? And that led me and my team to work over a decade and a half to have this product in the marketplace.
Yeah. I think, we often hear that in pharmaceutical research, not so much in other research, exactly how long things take to come to fruition. So that's quite interesting that it took that long to actually get a product onto the market. So, we'll definitely talk more about that and also FeLD1. But before we do that, I think it's probably a good idea to kind of level set our audience and talk a little bit about allergy in general, cat allergy in particular, but also kind of what is the underlying physiology, right? And how we go about diagnosis and management. So maybe, Dr. Satyaraj, you could start us off by talking about the physiology of IgE-mediated respiratory allergies, including pet allergy.
Right. Allergy develops in two phases. The first phase is called the sensitization phase, where somebody who has a tendency to develop allergies becomes sensitized to a particular allergen. And what makes an individual sensitive to that particular allergen is because they make a very unique kind of antibody called as IgE against that particular protein. And what's unique about this particular immunoglobulin IgE is that it goes and binds to a type of cell called as mast cells that line several parts of our body, especially the epithelial linings. Once an individual is sensitized, every time he or she encounters the allergen, you start having the reaction phase, which is usually quick, sometimes minutes to maybe 24 hours, where the allergen then binds to the IgE molecules present in the mast cell, leads to a cross-linking event that results in the release of factors that eventually cause the symptoms of allergy. An important factor that is released is histamine, and that's why people take antihistamines to address symptoms of allergy. So that's the general process in which people become sensitized, and then they respond with symptoms when they're exposed to the allergen. And that's true for cat allergies as well.
As well as food, or really just any particular antigen that may cause sensitization. So, you mentioned sensitization, and probably what I'd like to do is kind of explain how sensitization is actually measured, and how we go about making the diagnosis of allergy, and specifically, with pets and cats in particular. So, and anyone who's followed our Ask the Insiders is probably pretty savvy around this, but I think it's important to really say that allergy diagnosis is really a two-part process, and the first part of that process is really doing and exploring the history of what led up to suspecting an allergy. So, what was the exposure? And again, whether that was food or pets or pollens, understanding that you were potentially exposed to an allergen, and then what the symptoms were related to that exposure. And, clinicians will it's necessary to be pretty precise on this, which is why it's really good to keep a symptom diary to help your clinician kind of get to the exposure history. So once you've been exposed, we'll want to know, what the correlation was between what we think was causing those symptoms and the exposure, what the timing was. Did it happen right away? Did it happen an hour later? And then how you manage it. Were you able to did they resolve on their own? Did you take antihistamines? In the cases of severe allergy, did it require epinephrine for an anaphylaxis? So all this is very important. Once we have a history, then we do a diagnostic test. And typically diagnostic tests are into two broad categories. So one, we're assessing the sensitization of IgE in the body by either skin testing, which is typically done by specialists, by allergists, or blood testing, which is done by specialists and allergists, but also done by primary care clinicians. And when we do that blood testing, the first line testing is known as whole extract testing. So we're testing for all of the proteins in a particular allergen. once we know if someone is sensitized to that whole extract, right, that's considered sensitization, not allergy. The way we diagnose allergy is take that history that we talked about to begin with, correlate the symptoms and everything we know about the exposure with the diagnostic test, and then come up with a post-test probability and diagnosis of allergy or not. And typically, those type of tests are very good with negative predicting, so have a high negative predictive value. They can help to rule out allergy. When they're positive, we really need to use history to figure out how relevant those positivities are. And then one more thing before we move on, there's a second level of testing now available called molecular testing or component resolved diagnosis that is now available for foods, but also for pets and in particular for dogs and cats like we're talking about today. And that molecular testing allows us to look at individual proteins within the dog or cat allergen, and they have different relevances, and they may also help us to do several things that whole extract doesn't. And one of those is actually determining whether you may be sensitized to dog and cats, but only truly have a primary sensitizer and be primary allergic to just one of those species. The other thing that components help us to do, or these molecular allergy components, is to help us predict severity of disease or development of disease. And then finally, they can help with pet selection outside of just species, dog or cat, but they can also help with male versus female dog selection. And we'll probably talk about that on another episode of another Instagram Live at a future date. But that said, that's diagnosing the allergy kind of in a nutshell. I guess, since we've discussed that, now we're talking about managing allergies once we have a diagnosis. And maybe you could take us through the difference between managing allergens and managing allergies.
That's a great question that I think has to be described and addressed. Managing allergies, you typically manage the symptoms that you manifest once you're allergic, or you can also do other approaches where you do go through what are called as tolerance therapies, where you have to go through extensive treatment, usually some kind of immunization where you're tolerized to a particular allergen. So those are approaches that revolve around the individual who's allergic. The other component or the other approach revolves around managing allergens. And in most cases, people would like to take both approaches to be able to address the allergies that they were exposed to or responding to. Managing allergens revolves around the source of the allergen, and also how do you maintain the environment where you are present mostly your home. Things like cleanliness, cleaning very often, trying to move to a surface which doesn't help the allergens bind and stay. For example, hardwood versus a carpet. Trying to change upholstery very often. The second category is where Pro Plan Live will fall, because you're trying to address the allergen at its source, which is the cat. And we'll get into more details around this during this conversation, but the primary source of the allergen tends to be the saliva of the cat, which is where the protein FeLD1 is released. And as the cat's groomed, which is a unique behavior that all felines exhibit, the allergen that goes from the saliva into the hair and then gets released into the environment. And the approach we're taking is to be able to manage the allergen in the source in a safe and effective manner.
Excellent. So this is really the first time, that other than just managing the environment, we're actually managing the organism that is actually generating that allergen and putting it into the environment. So I think that really is a revolutionary.
Absolutely, yes.
So, we mentioned FeLD1 now, and for those that aren't kind of aware, the allergens are there's a nomenclature, and FeLD1 basically just means that it's the first allergen to have been identified within the cat total allergen, right? It's the first protein to be identified. Maybe tell us a little bit more about FeLD1, the role it plays in the cat, and then how addressing it really can help patients, live a better life with their cats that who happen to be cat allergic.
So FeLD1 is a protein, one among several others that a cat produces. That is the protein that most people respond to. About 96% of the people who have sensitivities or symptoms to responding to cats typically respond to FeLD1. It's a protein that is secreted in the saliva primarily. There is some secretion in the sebaceous glands, but the saliva tends to be the primary source of the allergen getting from the cat onto the hair into the environment due to the grooming behavior. It's also an interesting protein in the sense that it is very sticky, has a significant half-life. And what I mean half-life is it takes a long time for this protein to degrade. So once the protein is released into the environment, it lingers there and has an effect for people who are allergic for a long time. So that's the nature of that particular protein. The other interesting thing that we came across with this particular protein is that scientists today don't know the exact function of the protein for the cat. There are various theories about what it does for the cat, and nobody knows what it does for the cat, except that it's been studied quite extensively because it is the primary allergen that most people respond to. And that is an important element to keep in mind as we look for approaches to be able to address this particular protein in cats.
Absolutely. So I guess that leads us to the question, do all cats produce FeLD1?
That's a great question, and important to note that all cats produce FeLD1. There are no cats that are non-allergenic in terms of not producing any FeLD1. Sphinx cats that don't have any hair, for example, also produce FeLD1. And there may be differing levels of FeLD1 between different cats, but there is absolute data showing that all cats produce some level of FeLD1. There are no truly hypoallergenic cats.
So, that's a really good point, I think, to bring out. And, that goes for dogs as well. I think, we've all heard about these hypoallergenic pets, and there really is no truly hypoallergenic pets. We do know certain species may produce less allergen, and because of the way that they are, again, being hairless or for whatever reason may actually put less allergen into the environment. But there are no allergy-free or hypoallergenic pets, whether it be dogs or cats. So I think that's an important concept for the audience to know. So that being said, all cats produce FeLD1. How does Pro Plan LiveClear actually help us to address the production or the expression of FeLD1 into the environment?
So let's talk about the mechanism that Pro Plan LiveClear works on. We described earlier, once you're sensitized to an allergen, in this case, FeLD1, every time you're exposed to the allergen, you're going to have a reaction, and that's what the symptoms of allergy are. The approach you have taken is to add an ingredient that comes from the egg that goes and binds to the FeLD1 protein that is released into the oral cavity of the cat. Now, this protein is not destroyed. It doesn't suppress the production of the protein. It just blocks it from interacting with the human machinery that elicits symptoms. So now when this cat grooms, it releases this blocked FeLD1 protein onto the hair, into the environment, and the overall load of so-called active FeLD1 in the environment goes low. Therefore, your symptoms, it's less likely to have an impact on humans who are allergic to cats. The other important component that we might touch upon later is also the idea of allergen load. Whereas one of the concepts that's very important in allergen treatment that you might have heard from your allergist is symptoms correspond to the amount of allergen that you're exposed to. The sum aggregate of the allergen that you're exposed to dictates the amount of symptoms you have. So any strategy that you use to be able to reduce the allergen below what you'd call as a threshold, it helps with symptom reduction. And the threshold is different for different people, depending upon the level of allergy you have, the number of allergens you're sensitive to. So the idea here is you feed the diet renders or inactivates the allergen with its ability to interact with the human machinery, and therefore it reduces the total sum of allergen load in the environment that you're living with on the cat, and therefore likely to have a benefit in terms of reduction of symptoms.
Absolutely. And I think we'll talk about this later, but that threshold, right? Allergy being a threshold disease, I think is really vital because most people aren't allergic to one thing alone, right? Most people that are allergic are what we call polysensitized or sensitized to more than one thing. And all of those things add up. So if you're allergic to dust mites and then you're allergic to the cat and then you're allergic to pollens, you know, when all those kind of add on top of each other, they push us over, right? And they cause symptoms to occur. And they also cause those symptoms to be more difficult to manage with simple interventions like antihistamines than they would if we had a lower level of that exposure. So I think that's so important. So, you know, there's a lot of talk about science these days. And, you know, you're a wonderful person, and we'd love to take you at your word. But what kind of studies have been done, Dr. Satyaraj, to kind of demonstrate that this actually, you know, does work?
Correct. So we did a study that was published 2 years ago, where we were able to demonstrate that if you feed cats in as little as 3 weeks, of all the cats that were fed, 97% of the cats showed a reduction of LD1. 86% showed a reduction of 30% or greater, and almost half the cats in the study showed a 50% or greater reduction in the amount of FeLD1 that can be measured on the hair.
Wow.
And what you're talking about are active FeLD1 measurements on the hair. The study involved over 104 cats, so that is a significant number of cats for the study. And what that clearly highlights is that in about 3 weeks after feeding the diet, we're able to reduce the amount of FeLD1 that these cats are likely releasing into the environment by almost half. And this, so, when you relate that to the allergen load reduction, you make the connection in terms of the likely benefit.
Absolutely. So I understand how impactful 47% reduction can be, but maybe explain why that's, and maybe reiterate why a 47% reduction is so meaningful.
So let's go back to this idea of allergen load. One way to think about the allergen load is think about it as a bucket. And the threshold would be the size of the bucket. Once the bucket overflows, the water spills out. And that's when you start having symptoms. And as you explained earlier, the bucket includes all the allergen that an individual is allergic to. It could be dust mite, it could be cats, it could be other environmental allergens. And the total benefit that you're going to be delivering to the individual is to keep the bucket from overflowing. In other words, keep the level of allergen below the threshold. While the overall average reduction of 47% that you described in the study that I mentioned is not complete or total reduction, that is significant enough to bring the threshold of allergen below the level of which, after which you start having the bucket doesn't overflow. And that's the real benefit in terms of what it has in terms of reducing the overall allergen load of the environment that you're exposed to.
Excellent. So what about that? What about our cats? Does this food at all, is it safe for them?
That's an important question, and that was one of the very first questions we addressed. One of the things that we strongly believe in is that as Purina, we are an advocate for the cat. We create products that please the cats and the dogs, but it's important that what we do has no negative impact on the cat. So for this, we did a study where we had a 6-month feeding study with multiple levels of the active ingredient that we talked about from the egg. And at the end of the study, when you compare to the control-fed cats that did not have this ingredient in their diet, there were no statistically significant, no difference whatsoever in terms of their behavior, weight, coat characteristics, blood markers at all. So there was absolutely no effect whatsoever in terms of the biological variables that were measured in the study. And this is a study that's been published in the Frontiers of Veterinary Medicine. And the key here is to be able to establish that the diet per se has no negative impact on the cat. And that was one of the very first studies that were done before we did the other study that we talked about, where we were able to demonstrate a reduction of FeLD1 in the hair of the cats.
Excellent. So yeah, the number one tenet in medicine is first do no harm, and I think that goes for veterinary medicine as well.
Absolutely.
Right? So,
Absolutely.
so Okay, so we've talked about the effectiveness of dropping the levels that are expressed. We've talked about it, we've seen that it's safe. Has there been any studies actually that looks at people and whether, it actually improved people who have cat allergies and their symptoms after the cats have been fed this food?
So most of the work that we have done really focuses around the cat and the products that are developed for
Sure.
cats. So the two studies that we described, we established the safety of the approach with the cat, and then the efficacy in terms of reducing the allergen on the cat and eventually translating that to allergen road reduction. But there are collaborators of ours at Washington University in St. Louis that have done a study feeding the diet to cats and then see how it impacts people's symptoms. So those were published recently. If you'd like information around that, I'd recommend going to our Purina Institute website where all that information is available. We also had a lot of anecdotal responses from people who have used the product and the amazing results that they see in terms of reducing their symptoms, also interacting with people. So those are the human references that I can speak to.
Kind of some real world evidence there.
Exactly.
Kind of confirming the efficacy. I think we've discussed this already, but I think it bears repeating because it is so important for people. So what does all this mean then for patients or for people, for cat owners who are currently, suffering, with their furry friends?
Right. So let me walk you through a couple of elements of this stuff. So the first thing to keep in mind is sensitization versus symptoms, and we're really talking about people who are now sensitized and responding to the allergen. Most people respond to a particular protein called FeLD1, which is secreted into the saliva of the cat. And what our diet does is it has an active ingredient that binds to this particular protein safely and effectively without any effect on the cat and prevents it from interacting with the human machinery when it's released into the environment. And therefore, what you're achieving through this approach is reducing the allergen load in the environment. So once you feed a cat that this particular diet, you're reducing the active allergen that this cat is going to release into the environment. Now, this is not an approach to completely replace therapies. This is, in addition to that, an effective way of trying to address the two approach, manage the allergies and manage the allergen. What you're doing here is manage the allergen and safely and effectively reducing it below a threshold. And the threshold is going to be different for different people. There are other methods that you can use as well.
Yeah. I was going to say, and I think, that's really the take home today is, to manage our allergies, especially our respiratory allergies, we really need to take a comprehensive approach. And number one, make sure we are truly sensitized and allergic to the things we think we are, and then kind of employ a multifaceted approach to reduce our exposure to those identified allergens. And one of those ways of doing that is certainly to reduce the expression of FeLD1 for those who are cat allergic. And that is just one other step that we can take besides reducing the other allergens in our environment to make our symptoms more manageable, hopefully make our medications more efficacious, and really, help cat owners lead a happier, healthier life, with their beloved cats. I almost forgot, where can patients and cat owners, where can they get Purina Pro Plan?
So Purina Pro Plan LiveClear is available online as well as in pet specialty stores. Widely available that you could go there and
so pretty much anywhere that you normally would buy a cat food.
Absolutely.
Gotcha. Well, again, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to thank everybody out there, for tuning into this episode of Ask the Insider. We do know, pet allergens and allergy in general is becoming more common. So being prepared with the right resources, with tips, with easy to digest information that you can get on sources like Allergy Insider is very important. I do want to, again, thank you for joining us. And do you have any closing remarks before we wrap today's episode up?
A couple of things. One, I think, is this is really what we stand for. We really talk about people and pets belong together. And this is a great way for us to be able to really reinforce that in people's lives, help them get closer to their pets. And again, if this is a product that intrigues you, I'd like you to sign up at proplanliveclear.com. There's a challenge going on. You could take advantage of that and see how it affects you and improves your interaction and closeness with your pet.
That's wonderful. Thank you. So, as always, stay tuned for our next episode of Ask the Insider. And if you don't already, make sure you follow us on Instagram, like our page on Facebook. That way you'll have more information from Allergy Insider. And it's really your go-to medically backed resource for all things allergy. Thanks again so much for joining us, Dr. Satyaraj. Thank you out there for joining this episode of Ask the Insider. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.